So yeah, that's part of my argument for thinking that mobiles, in what they do to the way we acquire knowledge, have important implications, societal implications for what we call education. And there's a different way of looking at it, which is to look at things like the citizen journalism movement. I've got several images of the bombings that took place in 2005, July the 7th, and they show blown up buses in the centre of London. And the spin that's usually put on this is that these pedestrians, passers-by, took pictures of these incidents with camera phones. They went into networks, they went through to Flickr, they went onto YouTube, and the world could consume them unfiltered by the BBC, the Ministry of Information, News International, or anyone else. I mean, that's clearly not wholly true because, well, it's portrayed as democratic, participatory, and I think that's partially true, but we need to recognize that all of the networks, infrastructures, and systems they went through, Google, for example, are not democratically owned. They're large American corporations. And I think any reference to cloud computing, for example, needs to bear that in mind. But over and above that, there's the spin that was put on it. The conventional spin, certainly the spin we got in the UK, was that, yes, this was plucky Londoners, this was us documenting ourselves. Yeah, it might have been. It could have just as easily have been the bombers taking pictures of their activities and their triumphs and putting an entirely different spin on it. So if you take that remark together with the remarks about the World of Warcraft, then what we might be looking at is a kind of fragmentation of knowledge or learning, that it becomes more local, more transient, more partial, maybe more ephemeral, and a lot more difficult to pin down, and a lot more requiring a critical awareness. And all of those are challenges for education, partly because education is usually delivered for most people through very static organizations, very fixed organizations which are fixed in time, fixed in space, fixed in place, and not very flexible. And you could make the same remark about our political institutions, that they are fairly fixed and unchanging. And it also takes you near to a conversation about, well, which we hear in universities, about kind of the validity of peer-reviewed journals versus the wisdom of the crowd as expressed in Wikipedia. You know, again, we see the breakdown of a kind of hegemony of a particular set of values propagated maybe by, I don't know, white middle-class men in the 1950s. Okay, so with that bit of polemic over, we'll move on to a different bit of polemic. Yeah, I've got various snaps of the god Ganesh, who ironically is an Indian god, an elephant with a trunk, because I think 5 or 6 years ago an Indian network found that there was a market for people who wanted to jump the queue in Ganesh's temples in order to SMS their tribute or their puja to him. Gerard Goggins, an Australian academic and researcher, has devoted a whole chapter of a book to how many different ways religion, spirituality have exploited mobiles, how many cults, subcults, organized religions have maybe appropriated these media. There's now an iPhone app for Roman Catholic confession. So, you know, we're moving along with the times in pretty much every sector of our society. How am I doing? I ought to look at the... I'm just checking what people are saying. I could be talking to myself. My eyes aren't good enough to read the back channel. Oh, someone's cooking and listening. I feel so jealous. I'm talking and starving. Okay. Anyway, no. Someone says it's going well. Right. I really need a doll or something to talk to. Okay, there's another literature. I mean, a lot of the time what I'm drawing on is a kind of diffuse literature of mobilities, where sociologists are becoming interested in the social impact of mobiles, and actually a far broader definition of mobility than we're touching on when we talk about education, teaching and learning. But nevertheless, it's a subset of that, and it's fascinating and quite good fun to read. But part of their inquiries or their discussions look at how we inhabit spaces, cyberspaces, phone spaces, real spaces. And part of what I was saying about the world of work and how work pressures mean that our work mediated via technology can now inhabit our private spaces, on the train, at home. How many people check their email as soon as they wake up? Actually, there's probably a literature still to be written about how many people check their email on the toilet. So yeah, there's a depiction of pressure on our private space from the public spaces that we inhabit and have responsibility for. But there's also a literature talking about how the private spaces are fighting back. There's a very good paper by a colleague from Brighton called No Dead Air. And he's talking, and this was 5 years ago, the trend has amplified, that you can inhabit a private audio world wherever you are. You can have your noise-cancelling headphones with your music on in public spaces. And there's a picture of George W. Bush at the United Nations wearing an iPhone headpiece, I think, illustrating that very fact, listening to Country and Western, apparently. So yeah, there's a tension between private and public spaces and the ways we inhabit them. And that might have been true to some extent with with PCs, but clearly now we've got our music and our private spaces with us, and they're interleaved, interwoven with our real spaces. And I think that's a significant difference between the literature and the perception of cyberspace mediated by PCs and what we're doing in mobile space and phone space. With a PC, you've got your back to the world, and if you're using Microsoft, then, or any other proprietary operating system, then you're making a commitment to have your back to the rest of the world for 40 minutes or 30 minutes whilst it boots up and whilst you engage with whatever it is you're doing. So it's kind of cyberspace at the expense of real space, but with mobiles, not only is cyberspace and phone space interwoven with real space, you can engage with both pretty much simultaneously, but also phone space or mobile space is very multimodal. There are lots of different things going on, and you can be dipping into all of them on a second-by-second basis. A colleague of mine uses the image of wristwatches as an image of quintessential mobile learning. That you just look at the thing, it does what you want, you stop looking at it. This is not kind of working your way through WebCT's structured hierarchy of menus. This is just kind of on-demand, 30-second move on. So our access to private space is like that, just as our access to many forms of information and knowledge are like that. Kind of on-demand, very low overhead, low latency. So as I say, there's a literature that talks about how mobiles are changing our relationship to the various spaces we inhabit. And I guess because these sociologists have a bit of a blind spot about education and learning, we're not seeing a conversation about the spaces that we inhabit when we learn, the maybe private reflective spaces when we're thinking about things, the public spaces when we attend lectures, these semi-public informal spaces that constitute seminars and so on. So I think there's kind of work to be done about how do these various ideas play out in educational spaces. And I suppose, as I was saying earlier, there is a relationship between work and learning in some cases. Learning can be quite hard work. So, okay, what sort of spaces does education now inhabit in the phone space? Okay, next, what's the other next on the list in terms of how I see mobiles changing the way society lives and the implications that might have for learning and education? Well, maybe at a trivial level, it's certainly changing many of our social practices. How mobile phone interactions, for example, intrude into face-to-face conversations, how we manage those, whether they're intentional, whether they're not intentional, whether they're ours, whether they're someone else's. And I think where we haven't figured out how that connects with education is kind of renegotiating the contract or the understandings we have with people we teach face-to-face. A friend of mine talks about his school's mobile phone policy. He asked the head teacher how the phone policy was going, and the head teacher said, fabulous, they've confiscated 851 of them. That's not really working with the modern world. That's not teaching people that, how to operate effectively in a world where mobility is so common and where connection is so common. So I think in our lectures, in our seminars, we kind of have to get with it. And sadly, there are, on a kind of monthly basis, there are letters to lecturers, professional publications, where grumpy old men complain about the phone going off in their lectures. I think that's maybe indicative of the way that we haven't fully caught up and integrated this new sense of how groups of people, small groups, large groups, individuals, are finding their social practices changed, metamorphosed by the intrusion and the addition of mobile phones. As I say, I'm not sure if that has consequences for mobile learning in particular, but it certainly has consequences for the education system. And there's a different kind of consequence, actually, that Kenneth Gergen, a sociologist from Pennsylvania, talks about absent presence. And he's talking about families, but it could be lecture theatres, families where everyone's physically there, physically located in the lounge or the living room, but actually they're all located somewhere else. Conceptually, mentally, they're all actually online, instant messaging, iTunes, iPods, video, whatever. They're kind of spiritually and mentally somewhere else. And that's, I don't think we've adjusted to that in terms of our teaching practices. What Gergen doesn't mention is the kind of corollary that actually not only are some of the people that you think they're not there, I mean they're physically there but they're mentally somewhere else, but actually people who are physically not there are possibly mentally there. So it's an interesting balance. Who is it the people you're with, who is it the people you're talking to, who are the kind of ghosts at the banquet that you didn't realize were inhabiting it. And I guess over and above that, what we see in many academic research conferences in the UK is a growing kind of virtual presence, and we're quite clumsy about it at present, but we start with the idea that a research conference involves talking to the people in front of us, and then we'd like to kind of extend our reach by creating a parallel virtual conference and webcasting it. Then everyone starts twittering to everyone else, and then we have a Twitter wall where you can see the back channel as a side channel, and the multiplicity of interactions can be really quite alarming, and we haven't worked out the etiquette for it either. We have no new etiquette for conferences where what you thought were private remarks could be broadcast to the rest of the world. So again, a bit more renegotiation to be done amongst our community. Okay, so yeah, Gergen talks about absent presence.